I remember the morning when the goddess's eyes first flashed in the sun, how the city smelled like warm clay and charcoal, and my father's hand, rough with grit, shook my shoulder before dawn in the little room behind the workshop. It felt like waking in the middle of a poem. The world was not quite awake yet, except for the roosters and the women at the well whispering, and I could see the first thin line of light along the ridge above the Acropolis, like someone had drawn it with the edge of a bronze blade. I didn't want to move. The reed mat clung to my skin. The air was cool, and the coolness held the smell of wet clay from the courtyard where our neighbor threw pots, and the sweetness of crushed grapes from someone's basket spilled last night, and my father's sweat from yesterday's work that never fully leaves your tunic no matter how much my aunt scolds us and beats the cloth on the stones by the Ilissos. Up, he said. Today we finish the goddess. He said it as if we would both be lifting that spear of hers, as if my bones had as much to do with her as his, which I liked, even though all I was meant to do was carry food and stay out of trouble. He was a stonecutter, and, when he talked about the Parthenon, his voice went softer, like he was telling a secret. He showed me the lines with his hands sometimes, the sweep of a column and the way a column leans just a breath inward so your eye believes it stands straight and proud. He spoke of entasis and curves like the belly of a ripe fig, and of how light falls in late afternoon, and how the goddess wants her house to breathe. I tried to see all that when we climbed up at different times, but it was like squinting at stars. I noticed mostly the dust that smoked out from where the chisels bit, and the white chips in his hair like snow that didn't melt even though the sun was beating. He would laugh if I said that, and blow a shower of stone flakes from his beard. He had already wrapped flat bread and cheese and olives in a cloth and put it in a basket for me, my job, and another small pot sealed with wax for the sculptor's helpers, a jar of good oil from the last press with a little drawing of an owl scratched in the clay by my friend Kaman, who has a steady hand, steadier than mine, even though he can't help but brag when he is proud. He had been wrinkling his nose for a week trying to get that owl right. Our neighbor's kill had baked the amphariscos, and I could still smell the wood smoke on it, and there were tiny blisters in the glaze like stars when you looked close. Father lifted the pot and nodded. We'll not be the ones to feed the goddess, but we'll feed the men who make her shine, he said, and then he brushed my hair back and his hand smelled of stone dust, that dry, thin smell like the inside of a newly split shell. I pulled my chiton over my head and fastened the pin near my shoulder, careful not to stick myself the way I had last week, and wrapped my little belt to keep the cloth from flapping when I ran. My sandals were too big because they used to be my cousin's. When I shook them, little chips of white marble fell out, rattling like shells. Home will be loud today, Father said as he slung his tool bag over his shoulder and kissed his fingers and touched the doorpost. Keep your eyes open, Timorous. I always do, I said, which wasn't true, but felt brave to say. He glanced at me with his sideways smile that made one eye crinkle and the other stay serious, and then he ducked out into the half-light, heading uphill with the other men. After he left, I touched the smooth round stone I kept on the shelf over the sleeping mat, the one my mother had used for her spindle whorl. It was dark and veined and fit perfectly into the hollow of my palm, and when I rolled it back and forth in my fingers without looking, it felt like she was there, even though we buried her 2 summers ago. She had woven at the loom with that little stone to keep the thread even. When she told me tales, her voice bent like a branch over me, cool and spread out, and the thread seemed like a river running off her fingers into cloth. She told me about when the gods were new and the sea was young, and when men were made out of clay by Prometheus, who pinched little noses and dug tiny fingernails with a sharp reed and Athena breathed on them. She always touched my brow when she said that part, as if she were doing it again, just to be sure I stayed alive. Even when my father laughed, saying, Your mother's stories are as plump as figs. He listened, too, and his hand would slow on the chisel. I tucked her spindle stone into the fold of my belt like I always did and lifted the basket with the food. The amphoriscos of oil, I tied into a sling with a cord and hung around my neck. It thumped against my chest as I breathed and smelled faintly of the olive press, grassy and bitter in a way that made me think of summer fields and my mother's hair when she came in from the yard. The street outside the workshop was already busy. Even though the sky was still gray with night's last breath, there were little wakes of light where people carried oil lamps, and men in cloaks moved with ropes and heavy things. A donkey passed and left behind a warm animal smell, like old wool. A woman with 2 water jugs balanced on her head picked her way through the stones like a heron and called to another woman about who had married whom and whether the peplus was finished in time. Everyone talked about the peplus as if it were a person you could offend by being late. It would be our gift to the goddess, they said, woven with stories in it, the threads telling about battles and births and the time an angry goddess turned a girl into a spider for boasting. My aunt had gone to the weaving twice to help, and came home with fingers red, which she wrapped in a damp cloth and blew on. Athena will never be cold with this one, she said, and pulled the threads gently so they lay like the ribs of a fish under skin. I went the long way, because if I walked the road where the men carried the biggest stones, I would get pushed and my feet would get bruised by the gravel scatter from the carts, and anyway I liked to see the potters in the Karamakos wake up their wheels. Our neighbor had his hands in mud already and looked like some god of rivers who'd been caught sleeping in his bank, his arms slick and shining and his hair stuck to his forehead. He winked at me and took the amphoriscos from his shelf to admire it again before I left, turning it under the light like it was a fig I had brought him to guess if it was ripe. "You drew that owl?" he asked. "Come and did," I admitted. "Mine looked like a frog with a headache." "It looks like it could fly off the pot if you blinked," he said, pleased despite my correction, and handed it back. "Off you go. And if you see any of Theodaisa's boys, tell them I have that red slip they like. Makes the black dance when you burn it right." And so I went, and the city some mornings it's like a friend who has been sleeping in your room and you see his hand on his chest and you can't help smiling because even his snores are familiar. The di-pylon gate was waking up, the great doors swung back and the stone square where people call to each other instead of whispering in alleys filled with a low hum, like bees starting to warm themselves in the sun. I passed a herm while going under the arch and touched its rubbed smooth chin, as everyone does, for luck. The herms looked like watchful men even though they weren't, like uncles lined up along the roads, and I liked them. This one had ivy around his neck from last night's singing, and a little garland someone had hung like a crown. The Panathena way ran from the gate through the agora like a bright ribbon you could follow with your feet, and people were already marking places to stand, calling out where they would meet later so no one would get lost in the press when the procession came through with the peplus. "We'll stand by the sandal sellers," someone shouted. "No, by the fig trees," said another. I passed girls with their hair oiled and braided, giggling and holding baskets that were not yet full. They would carry things for the goddess later, and I thought how light the baskets looked now and how heavy they would feel when everyone watched. A little dog tugged on a boy's cloak and the boy pretended to fight it off, laughing. An old man with a lyre sat in the shade of a stoa and tuned it slowly, softly, as if not to wake the stone. In the agora the stalls were opening. A woman poured honey from a jar and it shone like melted gold in the early light, and bees kept finding it and stumbling on the rim. A fish seller slapped the belly of a silver-scaled fish and its tail flopped once, twice, reflex and shine, while he called out that it had slept in the sea last night. The smell of goats rose and drifted with the smell of smoke and baked bread, and now and then the sharp metal dust of bronze, the way your mouth tastes when you bite your lip too hard. Men gathered even before their wives could scold them to come home later, and they argued with hands, and laughter interrupted the arguments as if laughter were the fire and words the water, and the steam was the air between them. I paused at the painted stoa because I always did. If the city was a house, the painted stoa was its memory wall, where we put the things we want to remember so that even boys who never saw the fight at Marathon could say, "Look, Uncle, there we were, when we pushed the Persians back and the graves of men we loved lay in the earth with their names on the stones and their fame in our mouths." I traced the line of a horse's neck with my eyes, and the twitch of a warrior's hand in paint that looked like war in a story, grand but a little far away. A rhapsode stood under it reciting Homer, and he had a way of making his voice low in the middle of the name like his mouth was full of honey on purpose so you would have to let the syllables sit on your tongue. When he said Achilles, the chi went out like a sigh, almost a hiss, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise like little soldiers. "You there," said a man behind me, and I turned and found myself looking into eyes that squinted a little as if his eyebrows didn't agree with his cheeks, and a nose that was wide and honest and took up much of his face. He looked at me as if I had just tried to steal a fig and he had caught me, but he wasn't angry about it, only curious. He didn't wear anything fancy, just a chiton a bit sweat-stained from the climb and a cloak thrown over his shoulder as if he had forgotten he had it. "Yes," I said, and I accidentally stood up straighter because some men make you do that even if they don't mean to. "What did you hear in that man's song?" he asked, tilting his head at the rhapsode who was now calling out the cunning of Odysseus like a fish seller, with more flair than fish. "Horses," I said, and then flushed. "And the sea." And a hollow in my chest even though I wasn't running with them. He laughed quietly, which made his chest shake. "And what did you learn?" he asked. He had eyes like the color of olives when they are about to turn black, not quite ripe, and they watched as if what I said would be put into a bag and weighed. "That heroes are big," I said, which was foolish as soon as I said it. "That they're not to be messed with." "They were as big as they were allowed to be," he said gently. "Would you like to be one?" "I'm only good at climbing walls without being seen," I said, and then my pride made me add, "and I can throw figs farther than cumin and sometimes I catch them in my mouth." "Both useful," he said gravely. "Remember, the biggest heroes are not always the ones who shout loudest." "How do you make a human, boy?" "Prometheus makes us from clay and Athena breathes on us," I said, because that is what a person like me says when someone like him asks a question like that. "Does that feel true to you, in your belly?" he asked. He tapped his own stomach with his knuckles and grinned. "Not in the way that scares pious men, in the way hunger is true, and the laughter of your mother was true, and the way a fig tastes when you bite it too soon." My tongue went dry. "It feels like something we say so we won't be afraid," I said, surprising myself. "So we can know we belong." He nodded, pleased, and the wrinkles at the corner of his eyes deepened. "Sometimes I think that, too," he said. "Don't tell some people I said that, or they will make a chorus of geese and cluck us under," he added, and his laugh made me like him better. "What is your name?" "Timorous," I said. "Good name," he said. "It makes your mouth feel like singing." "I am Socrates." He said it as if he had told me the weather. He shook his cloak loose and the sun made a strip of brightness along his shoulder. "Now go and do whatever noble thing your father sent you to do. Bring the goddess her food," he added, straight-faced, and for a moment I didn't know if he was mocking me, and then decided he wasn't. He put his hand over his heart and bowed as if I were an ambassador from a place where boys were taken very seriously, then turned to a group of other men and started asking questions so quickly they barely had time to nod. I walked on, smiling, and at once ran into Rena, who was balancing a tray of little cakes with sesame seeds on her head like a ship on a silent harbor, the cakes stuck with bay leaves as decoration. "Rena," I said, careful not to shout right into the tray. She was taller than last year and her shoulders had grown straight and square from carrying things, and she had tied a pretty purple ribbon in her hair. "Timorous, you look like you stole a pomegranate and ate it before you could pay," she said. "Who did you meet?" "A man named Socrates who asked me questions about heroes," I said, and she rolled her eyes. "He asked me last week why sugar cakes are sweet," she said. "He is fond of asking and not fond of buying." "Sugar cakes are sweet because the bees make them with their knees," I said, and she laughed, the tray wobbling, then steady again. "Where are you going?" "Up to the temple in an hour," she said, her voice lowering as if she were telling me a secret, though everyone in the city knew. "They picked me as a basket carrier. I will try not to trip and spill barley in a priest's sandals." "You won't," I said, and meant it, because she could carry a sleeping baby and 2 amphoras at the same time. I had seen it. She made a face like being brave. "If you see my mother, tell her I didn't put the purple ribbon in my hair, it tied itself," she said, and then she shouldered past a pig-headed man who had stopped in the middle of everything to look up as if the sky owed him a coin, and she kept walking, the tray just as balanced as a thought in her head. At the edge of the agora, near the road that goes down toward the ship sheds, there was a group of men wearing striped cloth and with their beards cut in a way that made their chins look neat and long, talking fast in a language I couldn't follow and laughing at something. One of them was selling tiny ivory combs and little bottles shaped like fish, and he told me they came from Egypt, where the river is bigger than ours and runs backward and is full of crocodiles with smiles like old men who know a joke you do not. He told me to put my hand on the combs and feel how cool they were, how the smoothness was different from wood. Next to him, another man had a stall with bright dyed cloth and a banner that said he could write your name on a piece of leather in Phoenician letters and then in Greek, and the way he spoke made the words look like little boats with square sails. "Our letters are cousin to your letters," he said when I asked, proud and friendly, and he wrote timorous in his script and then in mine and held them up to the light so I could see how the lines related, like brothers who argue but look the same around the eyes. "Clever Greeks," he added, as if he were repeating something he had heard and agreed with only a little. I felt my chest lift and then deflate, like a bellows, because I realized how old some of this is, and how new, and how much none of us invents alone. You start to see that when you walk through the agora where every road ends and begins at the same time. Near them, on a low bench, an old man sat with an amulet of a strange animal hanging on his chest, its head like a snake and a ram at once, carved in stone I didn't recognize. He saw me looking and patted the bench next to him and made a little pot on his knee with his fingers, spinning it in the air like only a potter can do when he is bored and wants to impress a boy. "Gnum," he said, touching the amulet, and he had an accent that rolled the kh in his throat like a pebble on a riverbed. "He makes people on a wheel of clay back home, one by one. See." He twirled invisible worlds between his fingers. "Your lady with the spear breathes them alive or not?" "Sometimes she does," I said, thinking of my mother's breath on my forehead, and he smiled. "Then all is well," he said. "Because if men are clay, we are kin." I nodded and carried his words with me like a little jar of something, and for a moment I could feel the cool clay on my own palms, even though my father's hands smelled of stone and not earth. It is funny how one story makes another story glow brighter, like placing 2 lamps near each other and watching the room open. It took longer to get to the Piraeus than I liked, because the road down is dusty and every person you meet knows something you didn't know 2 breaths ago, and before you realize, you have listened to 6 stories and eaten a handful of pitted olives from a kind old woman who insisted your cheeks looked thin and you should eat or your mother would rise from the ground and scold everyone. I finally shoved half a loaf into my mouth and walked faster. The Piraeus lay spread out like a blanket on the shore, ships like beetles in the sun and the water winking as if it wanted to be part of the celebration, too. The port smelled as it always did, tar and salt and fish, a sharp tang of rope and wet wood, a clean bitterness like the breath of a storm. Men were shouting in voices with many edges and many rivers in them, and the ship sheds, with their long sides, made shadows like the ribs of a god's canoe. My father says the man who laid out the Piraeus Hippodamos, who parts his hair like he is about to split a log like straight lines and right angles, as if he is fighting with all his might against the way the world curves toward the sea. It works, though. Your feet know where to go, and the wind that gets lost in Athens knows how to move there. I had to deliver the oil to a friend of my father's who kept a little shrine in his shop to a tiny god of fishermen carved out of a bit of driftwood, net over his shoulder, smile like he had just got away with something. The man always gave me something when I brought oil, once a green glass bead, once a small fish dried in the shape of a coin that made my aunt raise her eyebrows but then eat anyway. Today he gave me knotted rope in the shape of a dolphin and touched my head twice, once for luck and once so I would grow like a healthy weed and not like a stunted olive. Big day up the hill, he said, nodding toward the city. Do not get trampled. I won't, I said. I am small and quick. Small and quick get squashed by sandals like grapes under feet, he said. Here. He tied a little bell to my belt. So I will know if you are flattened and I can come scrape you off the agora, he grinned, and then waved me away. By the water, a group of men sat in the shade of a pile of cloth bales and argued, not loudly, but in a way that made you want to lean closer. One of them had a faraway look, like his eyes were trying to tell his mouth something he hadn't learned how to say yet. He gestured at dust motes dancing in a shaft of light that came between the cloth bales, as if the motes could hear him. Everything is made of these, he said. Tiny things, too small to see, so small they make you ache thinking about it. They join and they separate and they join again, like us. The other man snorted and said, You'll choke on your own thoughts and forget to eat bread, but without meanness. I stood and watched the dust float up and down, not like other dust, but like little worlds, like he said. Atoms, the dreamy man murmured, tasting the new word, perhaps only in his head, as if it were a fruit with a hard skin and a sweet middle. And void. He laughed, and someone else threw a small piece of bread at him which he caught without stopping his talking, and I stepped away, the new word hitting some part of me like when a wave you didn't expect slaps you sideways. I didn't realize how hungry I was until I saw a boy snapping beans in a basket, his fingers moving fast. He looked familiar, and then I remembered his father, who had come from Abdera with the funniest hat I'd ever seen. This boy, despite the beans, sprouted words even faster than he sprouted mussels on sticks, and he told me all about how their town's wind was different, thin and hungry, and how his mother says Athens's wind is fat and sleepy and sits down in the squares to talk too much. We should go, he mimicked, and then he made his mouth into a perfect O and puffed like a wind can, if a wind likes markets. Do you think there are little things in the air that make us and its name is void? I asked him suddenly, because sometimes you lean in when a thought passes you by like a strange animal and you touch it even if you shouldn't. He shrugged. My father says men will say anything if they are not carrying wood, he said with the authority of someone with a father who says things. These beans are real. He popped one in his mouth that had not touched the boiling water yet, chewed, made a face, spit it out, grinned. Some things need fire. I took the food from him and ran up the hill because I had realized that the day had tilted farther than I thought and my father would be looking at the sun with annoyance if I came late. The road was dust and stone, and my sandals slapped and my hair stuck to my forehead and my back made a wet patch on my chiton where the belt was tight. I passed the Anakian where they say the Dioscouroi sit when they are in town and sneak into our feasts, and I thought about how some gods don't like to stand still like the one on the hill, but like to borrow a cloak and eat our figs and leave crumbs. The closer I got to the Acropolis, the greater the press of people, the higher the sound in the air, flutes warming, voices tuning to each other. I could hear the Allos players with their double pipes practicing a line over and over, a thin reedy suggestion of what would come later when the procession moved and the noise turned into a path. There is a point on the road where the bluff rises and you can't see what is coming next, and then it opens all at once and the city's crown sits there as if it has always been sitting, white and stubborn, and the air goes bright even if there are clouds, and everyone has to stop a heartbeat and swallow. Even the donkeys know to pause and blink. At the gate below the Propylaea, a guard with a feather in his helmet like a plant smiled at me when he saw the food basket. "For Fiadies?" he asked. "For my father," I said, "and for Fiadies's boys." "Even better," he said. "Go on. Take this pass. Try not to spill olive oil on the sacred stones or the priest will make you lick it up with your tongue," he added, eyes laughing. "I will spill it in his sandals first," I muttered, and then, louder, "Thank you, because my aunt says words like that are cheap and make men give you things you didn't ask for. The sun always feels double up there. The white stone throws it back at you so that if you are not careful you feel like you are standing in a fish's belly being boiled. There is also always wind, even when the streets are still. The goddess likes a breeze around her ankles, my aunt says." Workers swarmed over scaffolds like bees on a fallen fig, busy and sticky and ready to sting if you get in the way. I stood off to the side while a cart full of water amphorae clattered by, then slipped past men arguing about how to lay a panel so it would sit true. The first thing I saw when I reached the platform and peered into the Parthenon's doorway was not the goddess. It was a piece of her, a curl of gold like a drop of sunlight frozen in mid-air, resting on a table in the shadow. It made my mouth water as if it were honey, which is foolish, but true. A woman in a grey cloak and cloak pin shaped like a tiny owl leaned over it with a careful hand. Her fingers were steady and her mouth was set like the edge of a knife. The whole place smelled faintly of beeswax and sea salt and something sharp, like new leather from which they had scraped and scraped. Men moved quietly in and out, carrying things wrapped in cloth. It was not the noise of the marketplace. It was the noise of being close to a breath you respect. I found my father with surprising ease, as you can find a fig tree you know by smell. He was kneeling on a plank, face level with a carving of leaves that would run along the top, his fingertips black with stone dust, his eyes bright as if he had been awake for 3 days and was happy that way. He didn't take his eyes off what he was doing, but his hand snaked out and found my calf and squeezed, an anchor, and then he glanced up and grinned and his whole face turned toward me as flowers do when the sun touches them. "There you are," he said, and then he called to a man next to him, "My son, with food," and 20 heads turned as if I were a goddess myself. For a little while, all that existed was bread and olives and cheese and the sound men make when they put food into their mouths after they have not had time to think of their mouths for hours. It's a piece of music you can't write down. They sat on stones and planks and steps and on the floor with their legs crossed, and the dust settled on their knuckles and then someone sneezed it off in a cloud of laughter. They teased each other and shoved, and someone sang a bit of a song that sounded like a flute, but he forgot the words halfway through and made up new ones and got pelted with crumbs. I looked over my father's shoulder into the hall where the goddess stood, and my whole body shivered like a dog shaking water off after a dive. You can say gold and ivory, and it is not wrong, but it is not the same as standing where the air seems to gather around one point and hold still for a breath before it moves again. Athena stood, tall and easy, like someone who knows where all the doors in a house go and which ones to leave open so the breeze gets in at the right times. Her spear lifted toward the high ceiling, and her shield and sandals and the edges of her robe caught the little pieces of sun that made it in past the doorway and the workers and turned them into something that seemed to fall out of the air itself. Her face, people say ivory is cold, but it isn't. It is simply not warm the way a human face is warm. It is the cool of a stream in shade. It made the gold around it sing louder, the way shadows make light more bright. On the top of her helmet, little creatures shaped of gold caught my eye and then wouldn't let go. I saw a sphinx leaning forward as if to ask a question I could not answer, and on the sides griffins, feathers sharp like a winter morning. The gorgon's head on her chest, coiled in the folds, watched me with unblinking eyes that made a small shiver go up the back of my neck and down again. Later, when the fuel lamps would be lit in winter and the walls would be warm with breath, I imagined how that gaze would seem to move even if it did not, changing the air with its not moving. She held in her hand a little statue of Nike, little compared to her, that is, she was big enough to make a boy's mouth open like a fish, and Nike seemed to be landing on her palm, or perhaps just about to leap off, one of those moments that might go either way. The folds of Athena's robe flowed like water had once flowed, and then the goddess told it to stand still. Her feet, one slightly forward, made me want to stand that way. I did, then felt foolish and stepped back. My father noticed and smiled with his eyes. "She makes all of us stand up straight," he said. "Even men with crooked backs." I nodded. There were so many small things. A serpent coil lay by her shield, and it reminded me of the story my aunt told, about the little king born out of the earth in our city's beginning, saved by a snake and raised by a goddess in secret. The smell of beeswax hung around her, and the ivory, there is a smell to ivory that is like old snow and also like the inside of a tooth, if you've ever had to spit a piece of tooth out after biting a stone that hid in your lentils. On the base I did not notice it at first, and then I could not see anything else for a while. There was a crowd of figures carved with care and painted, I think, in ways I could not quite see from where I stood. My father's friend Phanos, who had always been kind to me because once he caught me as I slipped on a wet plank and pulled me back by my hair, saw me squinting and let me stand on a little chest of tools. That is how I saw Pandora. It took me a moment to understand, because we are used to seeing men in our stories, and when women stand in the middle of something like the first of something, you realize that your feet are on a different floor than you thought. On that base, carved neatly and with a kind of smile within it, was the making of the first woman, said the little sign someone had scratched discreetly near the edge because men like to point at their work and not let the work point at itself. A god held a jar, the one that is not really a box though everyone calls it a box, and she stood in the midst of them looking as if she had just realized she could sing. Around her, gods and goddesses bent their heads, giving gifts. My mother had told me that story, too, and I had not liked it much, because it is too easy to blame women for everything that goes wrong, the way it is easy to blame rain when you trip on a stone you did not notice and fall and scrape your knees. But here, on the goddess's base, the story was all faces and hands and little carved feet, and I leaned so far I nearly fell, and Phanos's hand on my tunic steadied me. Once you see the way the gods are carved when they give something, you cannot forget it. They look like the moment when you pass a coin to a friend and you know he will hold it like a charm, not spend it on fish. It is a small thing, and it is everything. My mother's voice was in my ear, low and kind. We are made, she would say, and we make ourselves. Both are true. Some time after that, when my father was called away to check a seam and ran his forefinger along it looking for a place where light showed through, I saw a man with hair that had gone gray too soon and a clean steady face, and I knew it must be Fiadias even though no one bothered to whisper. He was talking quietly with a man I had seen once near the Archon's house and once carrying a scroll, and his mouth barely moved when he spoke, the way mouths do when men are careful and certain and tired. He put his hand on the edge of the gold, not touching it fully, just the way my aunt touches a newborn's head to fix a lock of hair behind the ear. For a breath I was afraid the gold would bruise under his fingers, but a little golden laugh lived there instead. Men had whispered things about Fiadias lately, words like accusation and goods counted wrong, words that make women's hands slow in the dough, and my father had dismissed them with a motion of his shoulder that meant a dog's smell had reached his nose. Gold can be weighed, he said. Slander has no measure. Hold out your hand, Phanos said, and I did, and he placed a tiny flake of marble in it, thin as the skin of a dried onion, and told me to close my fist tight. That is the weight of a lie, he said. It is very light, and then it is not. I kept it for as long as it would sit there, and then I forgot and opened my hand and it fell to the floor like a piece of air, and I could not find it again, and somehow that was the right thing. When it was time, I went to the doorway and peered out, because the sound in the air had swelled the way river water swells when the gates are opened, and the procession was forming down below like a snake that had eaten something and was proud. The girls, Rena among them, moved in a line, the baskets on their heads now heavy with barley and bundles and things wrapped in cloth so you could not tell what they were. Rena's ribbon flashed in the sun like a fish, and I could see that her mouth was set firmly, the way you set your foot on a plank before you leap, and that she looked straight ahead and nowhere else. Flutes and drums found each other, grew louder. Our old men in wreaths of olive leaves and our young men with their hair shiny with oil and their shoulders like fields poured into the street together, and someone started a chant, and then someone else, and then all of us. A woman near me made the cry women make that rides the air like a thin bright bird and makes your skin rise in bumps, and though I had heard it before, it still reached down my spine and plucked like the string my father strums absent-mindedly when he thinks of nothing and everything. Below, the oxen walked with bells on their horns and with patient eyes, like they were used to being watched and were not concerned what the watching men thought. Little smoke flowers started to open on altars as men tested the charcoal to see if it took flame, but I turned away because even if blood makes that sound when it hits hot stone, a kind of secret sigh, I did not want to look at it this time. It is possible to honor and not seek the flash of red. My father says there is a time for it and a time to look at our children instead and count their fingers. Horses tossed their heads in the sun like they were carrying bits of the day in their mouths and did not know where to spit them. A group of medics carried trays of little jars of perfume, the lid sealed with wax, and the wax had been stamped with tiny ships and owls and dolphins. I realized for the first time that even the stamps on wax have things to say. Everything kept talking to me. The city was a chorus and a market and a war and a wedding all at once. I felt for my mother's spindle stone to touch it and feel her breath in my hair again, and my hand closed on a fold of cloth and then on nothing. I didn't panic at once. I patted again. I took the belt in my hand and shook it. The bell the fisherman had tied rang once, twice. No stone. I crouched and looked at the ground where I stood, where I had stood before, and saw only footprints and a fig stem mashed in the dust and a little broken comb tooth that could be ivory, I put it in my mouth to feel the cool, then put it back in my pocket because it felt wrong if I took it. My heart beat in my throat the way it does when you fall from a low roof and don't hurt yourself, but you could have. I sat down on the step, my knees suddenly water, and I searched the fold of my chiton, and then the other fold, and then I stared at nothing and everything and felt the place in my belt where the stone had warmed the cloth like a ghost of itself. I closed my eyes and saw it there, scratched on the inside of my eyelids like the after picture you get when you look at the sun, and then I looked down and it was not there. It was impossible and it had to be true, both at once, like the way the words of a man who suspects shadows are not the same everywhere land in your chest. "What's wrong?" my father asked, appearing as if the city had nudged him with a corner of its elbow and pointed his eyes this way. "My mother's stone," I said, and my voice was flat, and I tasted salt that was not sea salt. He bent down and snuck his hand into my belt, his fingers quick, his knuckles hard, the old trick with the coin that he always does, as if he will pull a coin out of my ear and make me laugh. But he did not find the stone, of course, and then his own face was a small story of pain, which he had to fold and put away because other men were moving things and he could not go anywhere with me. His hands were tied to this place. He gripped my shoulder and squeezed once so hard I will still feel it when I am old. "Where last?" he asked, and I could not answer. I had been everywhere since dawn. "Maybe the Piraeus," I said stupidly. "No time to go there," he said carefully, and I nodded, and moved my feet in small circles, like a horse tethered just out of reach of the bright green grass along a ditch. My father's mouth went sideways. "Listen," he said. "It is a stone," he added. "You are my son," he said more fiercely. "Do not be careless. But do not think the world can take her breath from you in a handful of earth.